My name is Sadie, and I'm going to be your storyteller for today's Story in the Dark. I'm so excited. I didn't expect for Iya to actually invite me to tell a story for you guys, but here I am. And yes, I have a very exciting story to tell. And Tachana here, my beloved toucan, is going to accompany us as I tell you a great story for tonight. Isn't that great? Alright, so let's get on with the story for today. The Elevator by Anthony Horowitz. Let's get over this again, the detective lieutenant said. Charles Falcon was a small, unhappy-looking man with graying hair and tired blue eyes. He was wearing a dark suit with a striped tie hanging halfway down his chest. His clothes were, like him, crumpled. He had been a policeman for 30 years, and as far as he was concerned, that was about 20 years too long. He has lost count of the number of murders he had investigated. The stabbings and shootings, the batterings and stranglings, and that was in addition to the armed robberies, burglaries, kidnappings, and assaults. He was glad it was almost over. 2 more months, then retirement back to Norfolk, a little house in Hunstanton. He was sitting at his desk in New Scotland Yard. There was a second man opposite him, 30 years his junior, neat and enthusiastic. His name was Jack Beagle, and he was a detective of lower rank than Charles. He had his notebook open in front of him. "Where do you want to start?" Beagle asked. "From the top," Falcon said. "Let's start with the family." Beagle flipped through the pages in his book. "All right," he said. "Arthur and Mary Smith live in Steinring. It's a small village near the South Downs. They own the fruit shop there. They have a son, Eric, age 11. As a Christmas present, they decided to bring him to London. Christmas shopping, lunch at the pizzeria, and the afternoon performance of the Phantom of the Opera. They had seats in the orchestra, A23 to... All right, get on with it," Falcon interrupted. That was the trouble with Beagle. Too many details. Give him half a chance and he'd be describing what sort of ice creams they'd had during intermission. Beagle flipped the page. After the show, they went to Covent Garden. There's a place in the new piazza that sells gadgets. Eric wanted a South Park clock. Insisted on it. So although they were tired, they went. They got to the station at 4:45. That was when he vanished. "Eric Smith," Falcon muttered. He closed his eyes and sighed. Covent Garden is one of London's oldest and deepest subway stations. There are only 2 platforms. The Piccadilly line runs east and west. There are also no escalators. 4 elevators connect the top and the bottom. There's a steep, twisting staircase, but not many people use it, as it has 199 steps. It was very busy, Beagle went on. After all, it was only 3 weeks to Christmas and the station was full of people shopping and all the rest of it. There was quite a crowd waiting for the elevators, and that was when it happened. The boy? Eric? I'm afraid he doesn't sound like a very nice kid. A bit spoiled and disobedient. You're not saying his parents did him in, Falcon cut in gloomily. He'd investigated just such a case about 10 years ago. Oh, no, sir. He's your only son, and they dote on him. That's why I mentioned the seats. They were the most expensive in the theater. Go on. They were waiting for the elevators and there were people all around them. Hundreds of people. The Smiths were at the back of the line. And then what happened was 2 elevators arrived at exactly the same time, one next to the other. The line moved forward and Arthur, Mary, and young Eric just managed to squeeze into the elevator on the left. But then, for some reason, Eric decided he'd get on the elevator on the right. He dodged out one and into the other. His parents called out to him, but it was already too late. The elevator's doors closed both at the same time. And that was that. So, he was in one elevator and they were in the other. Yes, sir. They weren't very happy about it. They told Eric to stay close to them, but like I say, he doesn't sound like the sort of boy who does what he's told. Even so, they weren't particularly worried. After all, it only takes about a minute to get to the top and bottom elevators, and will arrive at exactly the same time. Which they did. Yes, sir. They arrived at the top and the doors opened at exactly the same second. The crowd poured out and here's the rub. There was no sign of Eric. The boy had disappeared. They were certain he'd gotten into the elevator. We have a witness, a Mrs. Nericott, who saw him run out of one elevator and into the other. Did Mrs. Nericott get into the elevator with him? No, sir. There wasn't room. But she definitely saw the door close with the boy inside. All right. Falcon reached into his pocket and took out a chocolate bar. It was his last one. He ate it himself. So, Eric was in one elevator and his parents were in another. Could he have slipped out ahead of them at the top? No, they've had seen. And anyway, there's the security tape. Let's take another look at it. They were closed-circuit television cameras at Covent Garden, just as there as every London station. The time-coded tape had been sent over to New Scotland Yard and for the 10th time, Falcon ran it on his monitor. The film was black and white, a little muddy but still clear enough. He could see everything. Was Arthur and Mary Smith, both of them weighed down with a load of bags and packages. Arthur was short and bald in his late 40s. Mary was a slightly mousy woman with permed hair, wearing a thick coat. Eric was standing next to them. He wasn't holding anything. He was plump with jug ears and freckles, like me. His hair was spiky and Falcon knew from color photographs sent to his office, ginger colored. He was wearing combat pants and down vest with a scarf around his neck, but no jacket. The film showed exactly what happened. That was the hell of it. The whole thing had been recorded. At 16:44 and 05 seconds, the elevator arrived simultaneously at the bottom. The crowd surged forward. Falcon saw Arthur and Mary Smith get into the car on the left with her son, and there, on the screen, Eric suddenly riding into the car on the right, squeezing in between the crowd. He saw Arthur turn and realize what the boy had done. He saw Arthur call out, although, of course, there was no sound. Both elevators were already closing. It was all exactly as Beagle had described. Cut now to the top floor. There was no camera inside the elevators. The time on the tape was 16:45 and 03 seconds. 58 seconds have passed. Both elevators' doors opened. The elevators at Covent Garden actually have two sets of doors, one in the front and one in the back. You enter the elevator from one side, but you exit through the other. Arthur and Mary were the last to come out. There were people everywhere, bustling forward through the automatic turnstiles. The camera mounted over the exit picked up every one of them, and Falcon leaned forward, examining the faces carefully. There were old people and young people, well-dressed people and scruffy ones. A big man with a beard and a wart on his nose fed his ticket into the machine. A teenager carrying a football followed right behind him. Then there was a woman chewing gum, another woman walking with her arms crossed. There was a man blowing his nose into a handkerchief, a second man already lighting a cigar. A Chinese woman with a swollen cheek and an old woman bent over double, supporting herself on a thick walking stick. A constant stream of humanity flowing out of the elevator and away from the station. But there was no sign of Eric. It was an impossible magic trick. Arthur and Mary were there on the screen, searching everywhere, beginning to panic. A few minutes later, they would call the police, but it was already too late. The boy had gone. Falcon flicked a button and the picture froze. "So what do you think?" he asked. "I don't know, sir." Falcon had never heard his junior officer sound so defeated. "I just can't work it out at all. I mean, we can actually see it. That's what beats me. It happened exactly how Mr. and Mrs. Smith described it." "Where are the parents?" "They're waiting downstairs." Arthur and Mary were sitting in a room that smelled of new paint and old disinfectant. Her eyes were red from crying. Her husband had one hand resting on her arm, trying to comfort her. But he looked as lost as she did. "We don't often come up to London," he said. But Eric insisted. He wanted to go to Hamley's and see their musical. "We should have run after him," Mary stammered, fresh tears brimming at her eyes. "But it was very difficult." "We had all his presents," Arthur explained. "Eric had chosen a new train set, and the walkie-talkies, the keyboards, the rollerblades, and the modeling kit. We had so many bags we could hardly move." "My little angel," Mary wailed. "He wasn't a complete angel," Arthur said gently. "I mean, we told him to stay close to us, but he wouldn't listen. And the truth is, he'd been in a bad mood all day. He was very upset when we wouldn't buy him the remote control helicopter." "But it was $200. He was also sick after that third ice cream at the theater. Maybe that was why he decided to run out of the elevator like that. Arthur Smith shook his head. We did tell him to stay closed. Just find him for us, Mary said. She took out a handkerchief and dabbed her eyes. He's got to be somewhere. Late that night, the two detectives returned to the Covent Garden station. The subway had already closed down, but the station was busy. There were police officers everywhere, searching through the ticket office and moving slowly step by step. And down the stairs, there were more policemen below, some with dogs sniffing along the platforms and even following the tracks into the tunnel itself. Both the elevators were being examined by forensic scientists in white coats and plastic gloves. The ticket machine had been opened and all the tickets, thousands of them, retrieved. There was just a chance that the police might find a fingerprint on one of them. Maybe it would lead them to a maniac, a murderer. But even that wouldn't explain how the 11-year-old boy with at least 30 complete strangers packed in a tight all around him had managed to evaporate into thin air. Falcon peered into the elevator that had carried Eric up. It was an ugly metal box with a heavy sliding door at each end. There was a small window in the side, but the glass was too dirty to see through, and anyway, it was impossible to climb out. There was something almost Victorian about it all. The whole station was grimy and old-fashioned. The passageways lined with off-white tiles carved into the distance. The floor was black concrete, with no trains coming and no passengers to add color and movement. The place was somehow eerie and unnerving. The cold night air whispered over Falcon's neck and he shivered. He turned to Beagle. "Have you spoken to anyone who got into the elevator with the boy?" he asked. "No, sir." Beagle shook his head. By the time the parents realized the boy had gone, it was too late. They've all passed through the turnstiles and out the streets. We'd put up a sign outside asking for people to come forward. Yes, I saw it. But so far, no luck. There was a movement behind them and one of the forensic men appeared clutching a plastic evidence bag. There were 3 dirty swabs inside. "Excuse me, sir," he began. "Yes, we found traces of blood on the floor of the elevator." He handed the Falcon the bag. "Type O, and it's fresh." "The boys?" "Impossible to say at this stage, sir, but I think it's likely." "And that's all?" "One button of a shirt. Could be his, could be anyone's. We're going to try and match it up." "Thank you." Falcon took the elevator back to the surface. He felt almost suffocated standing inside the metal box. There was a lurch as the car began to rise and then nothing but the creak of the ancient cables pulling him slowly up. What had happened to Eric Smith when he had taken the elevator at 4:45 that afternoon? He couldn't have climbed onto the roof or anything like that. He couldn't have left it all until the doors opened. But he had definitely gotten in and he definitely hadn't gotten out. It was enough to drive the detective crazy. There was a team of policemen on the top floor examining a great pile of tickets taken out of the machines. One of them looked up as Falcon emerged from the elevator. What was his name? Williams or Willard or something? "What have you got?" Falcon demanded. "Nothing very much, sir, except one thing." Go on. When the used tickets are sucked into the machine, they fall into a compartment, sir. They are emptied regularly throughout the day, but nobody touched the machines after the boy disappeared. So at least we've been able to work out more or less where people were coming from around about 4:45 this afternoon. And, well, it's quite strange really. There were about 40 tickets from the same station, Burnt Oak. It struck me as odd. Why? Well, sir, Burnt Oak isn't a very important station, tucked away at the end of the Northern Line, and it just seems strange that so many people should have made the same journey. Burnt Oak to Covent Garden at exactly the same time. All right, Williams, Falcon said. Have the tickets sent to my office? Yes, sir, the policeman scowled. My name's Willard, sir. Later that night, Falcon lay in a bed in the small apartment he rented in Back Street in Victoria. He was only half asleep. He was trying to dream about Norfolk. He could just picture himself out on the beach, watching the sunset with his dog. What sort of dog would he buy? An Alsatian, perhaps? No, that would remind him too much of the police. But try as he might, he couldn't dream what he wanted to dream. The scene kept changing. There was Eric Smith standing on the sand in his combat pants, surrounded by people carrying packages and shopping bags. Something rose out of the sea. It was the elevator. The door slid open and Eric walked into it. But now the elevator had changed. It had become some sort of metallic monster. And the doors had been replaced by jagged teeth that sliced down. Eric screamed. The waves rolled in and Falcon woke up with a start. Surprised and relieved to see that it was 7 o'clock, the start of another day. Beagle was waiting for him at the office. We've had a breakthrough, he said. Oh yes? Falcon had bought himself a bacon on a roll on the way in. It was still in the bag, beginning to get cold. One of the men on the screen, Beagle said. He was pleased with himself, and Falcon guessed that he had probably been working all night. One of the men in the elevator with the boy. I thought I knew him from somewhere, and I was right. He took out a photograph and slid it into the desk in front of Falcon. A big man with a bird and a wart on his nose. Falcon remembered him from the security pictures. Who is he? He asked. He's a professor at the University of London. Also a writer. His name is Abraham Orlov. Doesn't sound English. I believe he was born in the Ukraine. Falcon studied the photographs. You said you knew him, he muttered. Has he got a criminal record? No, sir. But I was at London University and although I never met him personally, he stuck in my mind. Do you remember that plane crash about 8 years ago? Falcon shook his head. A small plane went down in the Arctic Circle. There were 70 people on board, mainly academics, geologists, that sort of thing. They've been studying the ozone layer up in Greenland. It was assumed that they were all killed, but in fact more than half of them survived. Stuck on the ice for almost 5 months. Yes, Falcon did remember something now. The story had made every newspaper at the time. There was something about it that made him feel uneasy. What was it? Orlov was one of them, Beagle went on. He wrote a book about it afterward. The Will to Survive. That was the title. I never read it myself. Anyway, at least it means we found one person who was in the elevator with Eric Smith. I thought you might want to speak to him. Do you have an address? Half an hour later, Falcon and Beagle were sitting in a small room on Gower Street, close to the Tottenham Court Road subway station. The room was so cluttered with books that it was almost impossible to move. There were books on shelves on every seat and in great stacks on the carpet. A pair of tattered curtains hung over a window that looked out onto a bare brick wall. Very little light focused its way into the room. Abraham Orlov was a big man, bigger even than the camera had made him appear. He was wearing a red vest stretched over a great barrel of a chest, and his shoulders were so broad that his head seemed almost lost. Balanced on a sprawling cushion of a beard that totally concealed his neck. His hands and wrists were also hairy, and he had thick, bushy eyebrows. He wore thin gold glasses and smoked a pipe that had filled the room with cloudy of blue-gray smoke. Yes, indeed, Lieutenant, he was saying. He had a loud, hollow voice and an Eastern European accent. I was almost suddenly in London last night. May I ask what you were doing? Falcon said. My dear sir, you may ask what you like. I have nothing to hide. He smiled, and Falcon felt a shiver of disgust. The man had repulsive teeth. They were yellow and uneven and somehow looked too sharp for a human being. He had seen more attractive teeth than that in a dog. Last night was an important anniversary. I met some very dear friends at our club, and then we traveled into town together to see a concert. It was your birthday, sir? No. You haven't read my book, Lieutenant. The eyes twinkled behind the glasses. It was exactly 8 years since my rescue. Our rescue from the Arctic ice cap. Everyone thought we were dead, but then they found we were living. You can imagine, my dear sir, that we survivors became very close, trapped in the wreckage of our plane for so many months. When we returned to civilization, we decided to form a club. We purchased our own small clubhouse tucked away in the north of this delightful city. Nothing elaborate. It's just somewhere private where we can talk in comfort. And we often meet there socially. This clubhouse wouldn't happen to be in Burnt Oak, would it, sir? Beagle asked. As a matter of fact, it is just off the Edgware Road. We all met there at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and then traveled into town together. How many of you were there? There are 51 members in the club, including myself. Not everyone could make it last night, but 35 of us set out together. One on the northern line from Burnt Oak Station. He nodded at Beagle. Change at King's Cross. 51 members, Falcon said. He remembered what Beagle had told him that morning. But I understand there were 70 people on the plane. Alas, 19 of them failed to survive, Orlov said. He twisted his face into an expression of pain. You must know the story, Detective Lieutenant. I made no secret of it. In fact, I wrote a book about it. 19 people were killed in the crash. The rest of us were trapped. We had water. We could use melted ice. But we had no food. I'm afraid that the will to survive forced us to make a painful decision. Yes, sir, Falcon said, but he already knew what was coming. Now he remembered the newspaper reports from 8 years ago before. We were forced to cannibalize the corpses. For 5 months, we ate nothing but human flesh. For a brief moment, Orlov's tongue appeared protruding out of his lips above his beard. Then it was sucked back into his mouth. It was painful and, of course, disgusting. To cut strips of flesh and lay them out on the wreckage on the aircraft wings to dry in the sun. To be forced day after day to swallow our unfortunate companions. I don't need to describe it to you. If you want to know more, you should read my book. But it was a simple choice. We could eat or we could die. We chose to live. If I may get back to what happened yesterday, Falcon said. Suddenly he wanted to get out of the office, away from the smoke, out into the winter sunlight. I wonder if you noticed an 11-year-old boy get into the elevator with you at Covent Garden station. I did indeed, Lieutenant. A rather fat little boy with a ginger hair, wearing baggy trousers and a scarf. That was him. He pushed his way in just before the elevator doors closed. Then he forced his way to the front of the elevator. He was first to leave. I was a little worried about him, as he seemed too young to be out on his own. But before I could do anything, he was out of my sight. I saw him go through the turnstile and into the street, but then he was gone. You saw him exit onto the street? Beagle asked. Absolutely! But forgive me, sir, Beagle was confused. The security cameras at the station show you leaving the elevator, but there was no sign of the boy. Orlov frowned and sucked his pipe. Smoke trickled over his lips and into his beard. Could it be perhaps that the camera was malfunctioning? He said at last, because I assure you, I saw him leave with my own eyes. It is impossible, Falcon agreed. He stood up. Thank you very much, Mr. Orlov. I'm sorry to have taken up your time. Anything I can do to help. Orlov waved a pudgy hand like a king dismissing a courtier. Falcon paused at the door. One last question, sir. Did you go to the concert, you and your friends? Indeed so, Mozart and Brahms at St. Christopher's Church in Covent Garden. It was a delightful evening. And I suppose you went on to dinner afterwards. Orlov hesitated, the pipe halfway to his lips. No. As a matter of fact, we didn't. We weren't hungry. The two policemen left. Falcon said nothing until they got back to New Scotland Yard. Sitting next to him in the car, Beagle had become more and more frustrated. And when they reached the office, he finally broke out. He was lying. The boy never left the elevator, and the camera is fine. It's already been checked. I know, Jack, Falcon said. The video camera with the security tape was still there and he turned it back on, but he knew what to expect. He was feeling sick. Just 2 months until he retired, 9 months until he left London forever. And this had to come along. Eric Smith had come to London with his parents, and just for a laugh, he had disobeyed them and slipped into an elevator on his own at Covent Garden subway station. Normally, nothing would have happened. Normally, he would have found himself surrounded by strangers and he would have arrived at the top at the same time as his mom and dad. They would have told him off and he would have sulked, and that would have been the end of it. But this hadn't been a normal day. This had been a 1 in a million chance. Eric had gone into an elevator with 35 cannibals. going out for their anniversary dinner. When the doors closed, he had found himself alone with them for 58 seconds. Orlov had been lying, of course. He had said that his experience in the Arctic Circle had been painful and disgusting. But Falcon had seen the truth. He had seen in the flash in those eyes behind the gold-framed spectacles and that little tongue, so pink and moist as it passes over his lips. Perhaps they'd hated it at first. The survivors in that plane, having to survive for 5 months eating human flesh. But suppose they have come to enjoy it. Suppose they had come to like the taste. They had 19 bodies, 38 roast shoulders, 38 roast legs, 190 stewed knuckles. Day after day they would have sat there, feasting. But then, after they were rescued, how would they have coped? No more human flesh. Oh yes, they could meet in their little clubhouse and talk about it, relive all those happy meals. But they could only dream of the succulent pink meat, and all the time they would be hungry. So hungry. Until a small plump boy walked right into the middle of them and the door closed, and they suddenly realized they couldn't resist it anymore, and as one they had fallen on him with teeth and nails. Falcon didn't like to think about it. At least it would have been over for Eric very quickly. He forced himself to look at the screen. There was Orlov walking out of the elevator. Orlov and his friends. Was it really gum that the woman was chewing? Was the man with a handkerchief blowing his nose or wiping his mouth? That Chinese woman, was her cheek swollen, or was it just that her mouth was full? The old woman with the walking stick. Looking more closely, Falcon could see that the handle was shaped very much like a child's foot. And as for the teenager with the football, he wondered how if it actually was a football at all. He turned off the machine. "Are you all right, sir?" Meagle asked. No, Falcon sat staring at the blank screen. 2 questions were going through his mind. How was he going to tell the parents what he knew? And no wonder Orlov had been so calm. How was he ever going to prove it? The end. So how was that story? Did it make you hungry? Made me hungry. I wonder what I can eat for dinner after this. Definitely not meat though. No, definitely not meat. After that story, just no. Oh, poor boy. Imagine being eaten alive. I mean, jeez. So I hope you enjoyed that. This is me, Sadie, again. Until the next Stories in the Dark. And be careful when you ride elevators, kids. Make sure all of them all the people inside the elevator are normal human beings. Isn't that right, Tachana? Bye.